Good afternoon, and welcome to the session titled The Maryland Black Agenda and Visions of Thriving Black Futures. My name is Tamelyn Tucker-Worgs, and I'm a political science professor at Hood College, and I'm co-chair of the Local Area Arrangements Committee for this year's conference. As one of several local and state-focused events at this year's conference, we'll be joined by 3 Maryland state legislators, Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary, State Senator Jill Carter, and Maryland Speaker of the House, Adrian Jones, and talk about the topic, Thriving Black Futures in Maryland. A couple of words for context. Maryland has the largest Black state legislative caucus in the nation, and in last year's legislative session, Maryland passed the Racial and Economic Justice Agenda, known as the Maryland Black Agenda. Last session, Maryland also passed significant and sweeping police reform, which, among other things, limits police officers' use of force and restricts the use of no-knock warrants. In this session, we talk with 3 Black women state legislators about these and other legislative priorities aimed to support thriving Black communities, and also the challenges and obstacles that they perceive to achieving these priorities using the vehicle of elective office. I asked each of the legislators to take a lead on particular questions, but first want to briefly introduce them. We will first hear from Speaker Adrian Jones, who has been a member of the Maryland House of Delegates since 1997 and the House Speaker since 2019. Notably, Jones is the first she's the first woman and the first African-American Speaker of the House in the state of Maryland, and one of only 3 Black women to ever serve in this capacity across the nation. Speaker Jones crafted and ushered through the Maryland Black Agenda that passed in last year's session. Next, we will hear from Delegate Vanessa Atterbeary. Delegate Atterbeary has been a member of the Maryland House of Delegates since 2015. In 2021, she was named the chair of the Ways and Means Committee. I want to also note that last session, Delegate Atterbeary chaired the work group to address police reform and accountability in Maryland. Our third speaker will be Maryland State Senator Jill P. Carter. Senator Carter has been a member of the Maryland State Senate since 2018, where she serves as Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Federal Relations. Carter also has the distinction of having also served many years as a member of the House of Delegates and has insight into working on these issues from both the House and the Senate sides of the Maryland State Legislature. So welcome again, all 3, and we're going to start with Speaker Jones. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to take the lead on several questions. And so I'm gonna start with Speaker Jones. And I want you to please talk about the Maryland Black Agenda. And I want you to talk about, what it is, why did you introduce it? What were you hoping to accomplish? What does it contain? And just kind of give us some general kind of information about the Maryland Black Agenda.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. The Black Agenda previously, and the actual full name is the Racial and Economic Justice Agenda, but we shorten it to be the Black Agenda, is the nation's first truly comprehensive statewide policy agenda for racial justice and economic progress. In it, we address gaps in health and wealth in Black communities. We advance diversity on corporate boards and address disparities in home appraisals and home ownership, among other things, just to make it short enough for you. Okay. Why did we introduce it? This was in response to what the country was going through. I'm the 107th speaker. The 106 white males before me. This was not an agenda item or topic for anything. So I saw this as an opportunity. If the old expression is just, if not you, who? If not now, when? And this when was way overdue. Our country was going through quite a bit in terms of unrest. And it partly was in response to that national unrest that was going on. What we were hoping to accomplish, I wanted to make sure that this was the moment to make meaningful and widespread change while we have the public support and the political will. As was mentioned before, we were focused largely on expanding economic opportunity, improving health outcomes in Black community by targeting 5 key areas: housing, to build wealth in the Black community through most common large investment in any American family has was their home. And we were required that a disparity program be done on home appraisals, which has been part of that. In terms of corporate management, in 2020, there were only 17 women of color serving on corporate boards. And since the corporate board's decision naturally impact employee and investment policy, we wanted to make sure that these diverse groups were represented in decision-making process. And we had entities that had also worked on that. As it relates to banking, access to capital and assets encourage entrepreneurships and provide a way to ensure people of color will have an equal opportunity to build wealth. As area of health, data consistently shows growing health disparities perpetuated by implicit bias. We put a greater focus on health equity because economic justice cannot be achieved without access to quality health care. And we worked with and put them on notice, both Hopkins and University of Maryland Medical System, in terms of when we had COVID. Previously, they weren't even doing data for racial data at all. So we made sure that that was taking place. And business and government, minority businesses have been underrepresented in government contract projects. And we wanted to make sure that the state plays a decisive role in helping minority entrepreneurs get a fair shot at doing business with the state. And we got assistance from that from our federal government through the Pell Grants that were put back in.
Thank you, Speaker Jones. I had a follow-up question that I just wanted to ask about the creation of the priorities for the Maryland Black Agenda. So one of the things that we study in political science is we try to think about how our elected officials, what are the different ways that the models, I guess, for representation that elected officials use? Are they, how do you receive kind of like feedback or input from the communities that you represent, your constituents? And so I wanted to know about the Maryland Black Agenda in this regard. Was it something that the community kind of contributed to what the priorities were, or is it something that was developed in the state legislature, or how did you develop, and anybody, can answer this question, can contribute to the question and answer as well, how did you develop the priorities for the Maryland Black Agenda, or the racial and economic justice agenda? And then, how did you develop, and how did you kind of receive or deal with kind of community input?
Well, for one thing, one doesn't do something of this magnitude in silo. We met with various stakeholders in various areas, African Americans, male and female, business owners. We also talk with everyday individuals, and from that, we knew that where we needed to go to make sure that we cover those areas that are concerned within our community. We only have right now, for instance, we only have one major Black bank. So that shouldn't be, but we, from various areas, we had gotten communications, but people had experienced when people were looking to sell their homes, and they saw a difference when the appraisers, you know, when there's Black pictures in the home, when they went to praise it, tends to be lower than the person who did not look like them. So all those type of things, combinations, what we knew, we just put them all together in terms of this is what we need in order to make this really effective with our, you know, our communities. Because like I said, we're on these corporate boards. I mentioned about the, you know, uh, the lack of Black and brown individuals being in these key boards, and we talked to those who had effect in making those type of decisions. So that's how, you know, we have done, along with legislation that some of our members had who had sponsored that or were in the subject matter of their respective committees. So it was a joint effort in, you know, in this.
Okay, thank you. And so I wanted to see if Senator Carter or Delegate Atterbeary wanted to weigh in on the Maryland Black Agenda.
Thank you. First, thanks for having me here as well. And as far as the Black agenda, I'll just say, and Speaker Jones is incredibly modest, and she will never, you know, boast about the things that she's done. But she said there were how many, 100 and some, you know, white male speakers that came before her. So when she became Speaker of the House, I mean, this is a big deal. She took the priorities of Black people in the state of Maryland. That these aren't new priorities. They had been around. They had just never been pushed to the forefront and made a priority. And she said, we're going to make these things a priority. And this happened as soon as she became Speaker. And it was embraced by the House. And everybody knew to get on board and to make these things happen. So, you know, I just want to uplift the fact that this was a huge deal. And it speaks to the fact that we had an African-American who was Speaker of the House and said, our issues finally need to be heard, and we finally need to move on these issues.
Okay, thank you.
I too, thank you. First of all, my first time speaking, so thank you for having us all, Dr. Worgs, and thank you for the incredible work that your organization does. We need you. We need the research and data that you compile, and we need your voice in these legislative bodies to help us push Black futures. I also want to applaud Speaker Jones on the Black agenda and also on her leadership on a myriad of issues. I think it's long overdue. I think it's critically important. We are now a majority minority state, which really would propel us to want to consider outcomes for Black people and how to empower Black communities. At this time, the data even bears out that it's not a luxury or an exotic effort. It's actually a necessity at this point.
Okay, thank you. So thank you. I want to shift to another question, and this is, you know, one that's taken up, I guess, by a Black agenda, a Maryland Black agenda. And I want to talk specifically about police reform, and I want to address this to Delegate Atterbeary, and I want to ask you, please, I want you to tell us about the police reform legislation that you passed last year in the legislative session. You know, this was very important legislation in Maryland, but also, you know, just for the nation, right? You know, so you passed some kind of groundbreaking, I guess, kind of very forward kind of thinking legislation in Maryland, something that other states haven't been able to do. So I want you to start our discussion about what it contains. What were you hoping to address? Also, what were some of your obstacles? Were there obstacles that you all faced? And, you know, how were they overcome? And then also how the public weighed in on it. And we can kind of talk about that on this, you know, how did the public weigh in on it? Because again, like I was asking Speaker Jones and the Black agenda, you know, how do you interface with your constituents as far as, you know, what people want and what they see as the problem, you know, as representatives. And so if we could start there, Delegate Atterbeary.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start out by saying this too was brought to the forefront because we have an African-American female who took charge, and after the murder of George Floyd said, we are going to make this a priority. I'm sure Senator Carter will tell you, for all her years in the General Assembly, she was trying to push forward legislation in terms of police reform. For my 7 years on the Judiciary Committee, we always had legislation brought forward in terms of police reform, but it was never made a priority. And so when Speaker Jones took over, she did say, you know what, we're going to have a work group to address these issues. And I like to tell people that the murder of George Floyd did not make her create this work group, because she actually had already committed to it. We had to get out of Dodge early because of COVID. So we left the General Assembly early, but we did start it after the murder of George Floyd. And so we did pass sweeping police reform. So I'm just going to hit the highlights, and I set my timer because I could talk about this at this point for hours. So some of the highlights: we repealed the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which is interesting because Maryland was the first to create that in 1975 actually as a protection for African American and minority officers, and then it turned into quite the opposite. So we repealed the Law Officers Bill of Rights. We mandated body cameras for the entire state of Maryland. I was actually surprised to learn throughout this process that all my jurisdiction, where I came from, didn't have body cameras. So we mandated the use of body cameras, which, as you know, not only protects citizens, but it protects officers who want to say they did the right thing. We mandated a uniform use of force statute for the entire state, which is critically important because if you're familiar with the state of Maryland, I live in Howard County. I travel to Silver Spring to get my hair done. I go to work in Annapolis. I hang out with friends in the city or in Prince George's. And so we're always moving through these jurisdictions, and we shouldn't have different policies that we're supposed to know as citizens that we're supposed to comply with. There should be one uniform standard of force throughout the entire state of Maryland. And so when we talk about a standard of force, that's when we kind of hear these things that the media always always focused on, like chokeholds, like de-escalation, a duty to intervene. So all of that will fall under this new force, uniform force for the whole state. We also said, look, all police records are not personnel records, and they should be transparent, so that if a citizen files a complaint against a police officer, it should not go into this black hole and we don't know what happens. We should not be finding out that an officer is on the force and has had 10, 15, 20 complaints against him. So now all this information is available to the public for review upon request. And unfortunately, I can't say it's going smoothly. So there are some nicks to work out there. There are some jurisdictions that are right now acting like they don't have to comply with that, unfortunately. Warrants, we increased the standard for no-knock warrants, which is, people kind of relate this to the Breonna Taylor situation. So we increased the standard for no-knock warrant. A warrant has several layers of approval that has to happen now. If an officer wants a no-knock warrant, they have to get approval from their supervisor and then the state's attorney, and then a judge has to sign off on it, and a judge has to make specific findings of fact. Who's in the house? Seems like common sense, but who in fact is in the house? Are there elderly people in the house? Are there disabled people in the house? Is the individual you are actually looking for inside that house? And they can only be executed between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. So none of this 3, 4 in the morning, we're going to come busting in your house and surprising everybody. We also passed independent investigation by police officers when there has been a police action that results in death or serious bodily injury. So the police aren't investigating themselves. So, you know, they're not investigating their friends that they play Little League with or go to church with or whatnot. And so we did in fact pass that. And so I'm excited about that. You talked about the civilian participation. So how this started, the speaker appointed me, I should say, chair of the Police Reform and Accountability Work Group. And it was a 14 or 15 member bipartisan work group. And we worked from May of 2020 until that October, I believe, October, November. And we heard from the public. One of the first things we did, we're in this age of COVID. So one of the first things we did was hear from 100 citizens on Zoom, and to hear what in fact they wanted. And when I tell you, we put the sign up for folks to sign up, it was filled within the first 20 minutes. We had over 90 people. And you know, if we had, for health reasons, if we had been able to do it in person, I'm sure we would have had testimony all night, quite frankly. So we did hear from the public in that sense. We heard from national experts. We heard from folks from President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. We heard from, you know, young progressive folks, like folks from Campaign Zero, who came and spoke to us. And then we heard from our community activists, from the ACLU, NAACP. So we heard from a lot of folks, and that was really important for us to do. When you mention obstacles, I will say, I think one of the greatest obstacles that we had to overcome was everyone knew we had to do something in the General Assembly. I will say that, but everyone did not agree on what that something was. And so we had to ultimately get to a point where we did agree. And that in fact happened, but everybody had different ideas about what to do. And the process that we followed in the House, it was in fact a process. The work group made recommendations to the speaker, who transformed those recommendations into legislation, which went through the normal process in the Judiciary Committee. It was sent to subcommittee. So it kept being vetted by different eyes of individuals. First the work group, then the subcommittee in the Judiciary Committee, then the full committee. And so I think that was really important, because each time, you know, folks had a different take on what we had done. Folks added things who hadn't been in the initial work group, which I thought was really, really important. So in that sense, the House finally agreed. We passed sweeping legislation after about 4 hours of debate on the House floor, which I probably should have worn more comfortable shoes. And then we sent it over to the Senate, and there was some back and forth there with the Senate, but ultimately we came together and we passed meaningful legislation, which is a guide, quite frankly, for the whole country in terms of what we did here in Maryland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to pick up on that last part, and I actually want to turn to Senator Carter and ask about the Senate side. And I want to push a little bit more for a discussion, because we know that Maryland has been working on, or at least in the community, police reform and police, you know, have been an issue for a long time, right? Before George Floyd, obviously, but you know, just for maybe decades, right? So just for a while, people have been working on this issue. So I want to talk a little bit more about the outside kind of pressure or activist work on police reform and how it may have impacted the state legislature. But I want to start with Senator Carter to ask her about the Senate side. And thank you, Delegate Atterbeary, for kind of really given I think for political scientists, just a real good description of what happened on the House side.
So thanks for the question. And you know, we don't have enough time. I could talk all day on police reform alone. Delegate Addition mentioned, you know, some of the efforts I had made in the House, and I want to say, because I think this is important, that for me it was a deeply personal issue. I felt that the legislative body refused to recognize my humanity and the humanity of my people. And so in 2016, when I resigned from the House of Delegates, it was largely because of the body's refusal to see Black people as human, when there was a myriad of evidence from all kinds of witnesses for several years that they were being brutalized and abused by law enforcement throughout the state, and especially in my city, Baltimore. So the Senate also, you know, the two chambers initially did not work together. They worked separately. You heard the whole elaborate work that the House did. The Senate also began to hold hearings. I think it was beginning in September following George Floyd. And we held a myriad of hearings, probably hearing from some of the same people that the House heard from. And then we crafted legislation to address the issues. And then we actually passed it over to the House, and they dissected it and made it made it, largely what the two came together on to pass. And ultimately, we accomplished some really good things. I like to just address a few things, though, that are still left on the table, because it's important that even though we passed incredible legislation, I don't think that our work is completely done. There are a few things that still need to be done, and there's legislation this year to address a good deal of them. So while we did restrict and limit no-knock warrants, we didn't eliminate no-knock warrants. And the country recently took a look at the murder of Amir Locke, and I think that issue is ripe for revisiting. The efficacy of having no-knock warrants at all should be on the table. Civilian oversight, even though when we repealed the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, we created opportunities with police accountability boards and charging committees within agencies that are comprised of civilians, we still didn't truly create an opportunity for totally independent civilian oversight of police and policing in their communities. And I think that's a goal for the future. I think we have to change our thinking about policing and the old structure that we've had, where police do what they want in secret with no transparency and accountability. And we need to really come to grips with the fact that police work for the people that they serve, and people have every right to have oversight of their activities, their misconduct, and their discipline. So I think that we still have something left to do when it comes to creating truly independent and police civilian oversight entities composed of civilians. Pension forfeiture. We took out pension forfeiture from the legislation that passed. Police that are convicted of certain crimes should not be entitled to have their pension. And so there's legislation this year that would address that and also ensure that it's very comprehensive. So it would ensure that, like, if their families or children would not be harmed by their loss of their pension. Anton's law. So the delegate mentioned this, that, it's important to be able to have access to these police disciplinary records, and they're now able to be disclosed under Anton's law, which is a big part of the legislation that we passed. But as she mentioned, we've heard from groups, organizations, and media that agencies are not complying with the spirit of the law. And so there is legislation this year that would put a cap on fees that can be charged for a request for police disciplinary records under the Anton's law. And then finally, qualified immunity is something that's still on the table that I think still needs to be addressed. And so I've talked a lot, and I'll just say that it was a very heavy lift for all of us, I think. And I think that there is some fatigue from dealing with such a heavy lift issue, especially at a time when there's a pandemic and there's so many other quality of life issues on the table for our constituents across the state. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to still, paddle uphill and get the rest of these things done while still working to do good things for quality of life in other areas.
Thank you. Thank you. And actually, that kind of leads us to our next question. But I want, but I want to turn to Speaker Jones about the police reform. Such a model for, I think, including the things that Senator Carter talked about still needing to be done, but a model still for other states who haven't even scratched the surface of this issue.
Yes, my office, and me in particular, received calls from members from other states on this issue, how you're able to do it. Former Congress people who were asking about it. And I found one of the most, there are a lot of things that were misunderstood as it relates to it. Primarily, I would get backlash that said, well, you're just going after police officers. And I had to clarify, sometimes you got to put things very plainly. I said, the majority of officers are good actors. It's the bad ones that we're going after. I had to say it, I don't know how many times I had to say that. to people. Yeah, but the people from out of state were more, willing to hear, because they just needed some guidance of what they can do in their state. And of course, their states are smaller and us, and they don't have the makeup that we have in our House, House and Senate. And actually, in terms of, as you well know, Tamelyn, Maryland has the largest Black caucus in the country. And so in that has helped me more in the recent years than in past years, because there weren't as many be able to get some of this done. But part of that misinformation that was out there, and a lot of time, and then people automatically, people who did not look like us would sort of kind of label things that weren't pertinent to the discussion. So you had to go through all that. But aside from that, the major issue, because we had conversations, bring them to the office or have a Zoom call to explain what they misunderstood. And once going through that, and the committee, they had Chair Atterbeary, she was chair of the committee as well. They took time to go through each area, and she would ask, anyone have an issue with this? And they would go through it to get the final product that they were able to get passed through our General Assembly. So it's you got to be able to make sure that people sometimes just make assumptions, but you also had to do with getting the facts. And I always try to, when somebody said something, I said, where did you hear that from? And then I said, okay, let me tell you. So that was the only thing. But I think the product, we had more positive about the outcome and then negative. And the negative people, I sort of like understanding, because that's how they thought. So.
Thank you all three for answering that. I think that will give us a lot to kind of think about. I want to turn to Senator Carter and also shift the topic a little bit. And so the theme of our conference is Visions of Black Futures at a Crossroads. And so I wondered if you could comment on this theme from your perspective as a state senator, as also a former delegate, as a person who has been really involved in I think, pushing this issue of Black futures. And you said in your last comment about in different areas, not just about police reform, but just, kind of different areas of life. And I want you to talk about what you think the most important legislative priority is that you've worked on, but then also what you see as the current most important legislative priorities for Maryland that would lead to thriving Black communities and thriving Black futures. And also, how do you navigate these agenda items in the Senate and and in the state legislature, period? Like, how do you navigate these agenda items, or what are some tips for navigating them? Okay, so that's my question.
Thanks for the myriad of questions. I'll do the best I can. I think it's important to note before I forget it, though, because in thinking of the answer to the question, I think it's important to note that even though Speaker Jones and Delegate Adderbeary and I are all Black women in the same legislative body, we've had completely different trajectories. Mine is completely different than theirs. And so, I mean, I was always what I would characterize as a bit of a reluctant politician. Like, I don't love politics, and I don't love the institution. You see it as a vehicle to try to accomplish some things that are important in my life, which is justice, a justice agenda. And so justice and equity. And that's important because my struggle has been real. And you ask about getting things accomplished. Well, certainly it's been difficult, and I have not always been successful. I'd say a lot different now that I'm in the Senate than when I was in the House of Delegates. But we have a lot to overcome, repair, and accomplish in Maryland because of bad policies for a very long time. Much of what is in Speaker Jones led Black agenda. She clarified the exact language, but we'll just shorten it to Black agenda for these purposes, is exactly what you asked. You know, the ways that we can shore up Black futures in Maryland, dealing with a lot of those issues. I would add that it's difficult to choose any one piece of legislation or package of legislation as most important to me, because many of them are important. I mean, I could talk about police reform being the most important. I know there was a time that I actually said, if Maryland ever repeals the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, I can retire a happy woman. And now, you know, to some extent, we've done that. So that's clearly wasn't, you know, the litmus test for that. There's a lot more to do. When I was in the House of Delegates, I passed a couple of laws that were named after Black children, and they mean a lot to me because I felt like it was a part of forcing the legislative body to see the humanity of Black children. And so one was Felicia's Law, which deals with missing children. We know about Black and missing, and you know how often Black women and girls, particularly in our community, that go missing, the diligence and the lack of notoriety and attention that's given to them contributes to the fact that so many are never found. So Felicia Barnes was a 16-year-old girl that went missing in my district, and we passed legislation named after her to change the age for what's considered a child when police step up and have police step up their efforts to start looking immediately with no waiting period, among other things. And then Christopher Brown's law was a kind of a first step toward the police reform that we've passed. Christopher Brown actually was murdered in Speaker Jones' district in Baltimore County all the way back in 2012, like really on the heels of Trayvon Martin, which is why I was so tuned into it. And there was no accountability for the officer, Laborde, that killed him. He strangled him to death, chokehold. And so Christopher's law just enhanced training. That was the only thing that we could get back then. Speaker Jones and Delegate Atterbeary, we couldn't get anything more. I wanted to do more, but that was all we could get. Just upgrade the training for diversity and use of force. And that was far from enough, but it was at least a step. And then finally, with respect to what's important to me on the table, there are two things this session, and they're far from the only important things. But one is we are looking at doing what I would call a predictive inevitability of passing marijuana recreational legalization for adult use in Maryland, and having equity and reparations as a part of that legislation is absolutely critical to Black futures. Everybody knows of the horrors and travails of the fake war on drugs. That was really a war on Black and brown people. And now we are about to put millions and billions of dollars in the hands of corporate interest, white people with a lot of money, for the same things that Black people were criminalized for all during marijuana prohibition. And so going hand in hand with legalization has to be equity, has to be how we create opportunities for Black people to participate in the legal industry, from licensing to retail business ownership to auxiliary services and everything down that chain from the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top. And then we also have to be intentional about how we target revenues to go into the hands of the individuals and communities that have been harmed most by marijuana prohibition. And as we always say, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. You've asked a number of times about how we hear from our constituents and how we consider them. Just a side note, a footnote here. We do the best we can, but it's still not enough, because the truth is most of our legislation is largely shaped by special interest advocates and lobbyists that represent corporate interest or business interest. And so while we do have regular citizens that tune in more now, frankly, since the pandemic and everything's on Zoom and live streaming, I would say it has to be more, because that's the people that we need to hear from, not the people that are paid to be here to influence us one way or another. So we need to do better with that. And it's not just us, the people need to do better. Like people, there needing more efforts to educate people and engage people in the work that we're doing. It's very important. Too often people spend too much time engaged in what's going on in the national level, as if what we're doing doesn't matter when it's closest to shaping their lives. And then I said finally, but I swear this is finally. Also, aside from the marijuana equity, juvenile justice reform is critically important. Maryland sends more children to adult jail and prison than any state other than Alabama, okay? And we've had data for a number of years that although we automatically charge children as adults, the majority of them don't wind up being convicted as adults. In fact, less than 10% of the recent numbers, meaning that we're charging children as adults automatically, giving them no option, and then we're holding them in the adult system pending trial. And then when it's finally resolved, they have no conviction in adult court because either their case is dismissed or they're waved back down to juvenile after they've suffered through the adult system. And so we have to fix that. There's legislation to fix that, along with the Child Interrogation Protection Act. We know that children are more susceptible to coercion when being interrogated by police. Right now, we don't afford children an attorney or even parental notification when they are taken into police custody and questioned by police. And that's critically important. And finally, I can take questions on that or talk more about it if you'd like, but it's critically important because the children are the future. And we're very hypocritical in Maryland about how we treat children and who we decide is a child. We cherry pick and we say, oh, in this instance, you're a child, you can't marry. But you, on the other hand, if you're accused of a crime for which you're presumed innocent, you can be automatically treated in the criminal justice system as an adult. So those are critically important issues. We have to decide that all children are children. We have to respect the neurological science and fix our juvenile justice system. And there's legislation this year to do all of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to pass that question around, but I also want to add this to it. Like, you know, I have been asking about community engagement and, you know, citizen engagement. And I want to ask what are ways that you see citizens helping to, kind of communicating or ways of more engagement for citizens to kind of make some of these things come about, or for you all to kind of engage more with citizens, and kind of like the other way around, to kind of put the citizens' issues and concerns as priorities. That's kind of something I've just been thinking about as y'all been talking.
So I'll
Go ahead.
I'll defer to the others.
Well, you maybe.
I'll jump in. So in terms of citizen participation, I think, you know, citizens have a unique opportunity to engage with their state legislators because we are more accessible, because what we do affects their everyday life. I know a lot of folks in my district have my cell phone number, message me through social media, and we get right back to those people. I'm incredibly accessible, and I know, you know, my district mates are as well. I think the question is perhaps how do we get more people? It's a lot of young people now, right? A lot of young people are engaged, but how do we get more folks to care, quite frankly, and not pay attention, like was mentioned, just at the national level? So I think in terms of what we do, we are accessible to folks. And in this age of social media, there is more than ample opportunity to reach us, not just email our office, but message us on social media and contact us. So I do think that's important. And of course, I think any legislator pays attention when you have a significant amount of people from your district chiming in on a particular issue, right? If we get 100 emails in a day or in an hour because a certain bill is being heard on the environment, let's say, and then their activists have sent out an email blast saying, contact your legislators, and we get 100 or 200 emails in an hour. We go through we don't have a ton of staff, right? I have one intern and one dedicated aide, and they go through and they figure out who's from my district, so I can stay engaged with folks from my district. So to the extent possible, I do think we are very accessible to individuals who want to engage and participate in the process. That's one of the things I love about being an elected official, because I'm a people person. And so I like and I enjoy and I do want to hear all sides of an issue, because I don't come from a place of I know everything and I know what's best. I come from a place of, just as Speaker Jones mentioned in the policing issue, we heard from all sides. We were on Zooms with the police at all hours of the day, on the weekends, in the evenings, with other, interest groups, ACLU, NAACP, whoever. So it was a very communicative process every step of the way. There were no surprises when stuff came to the House floor.
And I would also say that we're, totally in communication with our constituents. For one thing, as legislators, for those who are going on to a college, we can provide scholarships for them. And in addition, we have, as has been stated by Chair Atterbeary, we have that members from, a lot of times from our district that are interns, etc. I do a weekly newsletter that goes out to a wide mass of my constituents, let them know what is going on. And some will come to my district office, some who want, because of COVID, there's not as much meeting, but they have been in they have done that. And I have adopted areas of my district in which some of the community comes out and we work together on things, or or do delivery. There's a lot of ways of interacting with the legislator, that and also members will call about some of the bills that may not necessarily be mine, but they want to let us know that this is not this is a bill that they're in support of or not in support of. But they, my constituents, and it seems like in Chair Atterbeary, because they're not afraid to speak up and when they need something or have a concern or want a recommendation, because all that is what's entailed of being a good legislator. So.
Did you want to follow up, Senator Carter? Are you?
Thanks so much. I just want to echo everything that the others said, Speaker Jones and Delegate Atterbeary. I'm also very accessible, but I do believe that there's still somewhat of a hole that could be filled in terms of the general education of the public and general engagement of the public. And, we got to step up efforts when it comes to educating young people in schools about the political process, making sure they understand the difference between what the city council does versus the state legislature versus the Congress. There are definitely ways we can improve that aside from just being accessible. I think that we've got to do more to encourage civic engagement outside of just advocacy groups and lobbyists, like I said before, because those are primarily who we hear from on, the priority issues in the legislature.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I want to shift to just some general questions. And I think this first one that I want to ask, you have been kind of touching on, each of you, in your different responses, but I want you to think about kind of lessons for other states. As was stated earlier, state governments and state legislatures are the closest, closer than, say, national government to people's everyday lives, the things that impact people every day and how we live and how we experience life every day. And so I wondered if there are lessons that you have learned. And I know that Maryland has a unique, makeup. It's has so many Black state legislators, and it has a Black woman Speaker of the House. So it's different than these other states. But I wondered if you could talk about any lessons that you have learned that you might want to impart to other legislatures in other states, based on what you've learned from your work in Maryland, or anything that you kind of want to impart or think about might be useful to other legislatures in thinking about a Black agenda, or in thinking about Black futures.
I'm the youngest legislator here on this panel. And I think, people approach things differently. And my approach has always been, there are 141 of us members in the General Assembly. And it is not Burger King. You cannot have it your way. And if I could, that would be great. I would do so many things. But you have to get 140 some people to align with your views. And I think the best way to do that is to build relationships with people, build coalitions with people, and just talk to people that you normally wouldn't engage with. Politics makes strange bedfellows. Some of my closest allies have been people who I probably in everyday life would have never been friends with. But we vibe because we're great families, people, or we have kids or whatnot. And so when it comes time for sticking up for certain things for me, then they'll go to bat for me because they know who I am as a person. So I think that it's really critical to listen to people and to just talk to people and get to know people. You're not always going to agree, but you never know when you might agree. And so I just think that's just so important. And I just do want to take a step back in terms of engaging. And for anyone who's listening, who might be a college individual, I always have young people in my office. I'm a mommy of 3. I'm really, really busy, but I always, when I have an opportunity to go talk to young folks, particularly young women, I always do it. Even young women of color, because we don't get uplifted like other folks do. And, like a white man to be in politics, or a Black man, quite frankly, we just don't get those opportunities. So every time, I say, folks, come shadow me in my office. If your parents say it's okay, I'm fine with them. Come intern with me for a week. Just come and see what we do. And I think it's so important that we do that for young people, so they can see what we do and maybe get interested and be the future that's going to continue the work of uplifting Black people in Maryland.
I guess I'll give the speaker the last word on that, as she should have. But, everything that the delegate said, of course, same applies to me. I love, actually, like I said, I'm a bit of a reluctant politician, so I love when I get to talk to people that are not involved in politics. They're my favorites. But I think that it's also important to recognize what I believe is still true today, that the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman, as Malcolm X said in 1964. It's still the truth. And even though you have incredible Black woman speaker as the House of Delegates, and even though I'm in the Senate, even though you have Vanessa Atterbeary as a chair, there are still truly things that occur that don't occur when other people have held these positions. And so I do feel that we're always fighting in some way for our humanity and for the respect that we rightfully deserve in the world and in the body. It's interesting, the delegate talked about making friends with other people. I mean, I have a bit of a unique experience because, again, my Senate experience is a little different than the House, but in the House of Delegates, I had a really bad experience. I felt it was torture. And I had plenty of friends, but oddly, many of them were not in my own party. And because they saw me kind of as an underdog. And so even though we had different ideological opinions and beliefs, they, people of the other party often respected me and were kinder to me than people in my own party. So the issue that was talked about relationship building is important. I agree with that. But I also think it's important for people to realize that in these kinds of institutions, you know, the leaders have a lot of influence as well. And oftentimes, you know, they decide the priorities at the beginning of session. And so, especially in a place as voluminous as the House of Delegates, you know, often it's difficult. It's more difficult, I'd say, in the House of Delegates to get your voice heard because there's so many. And if you are in line with leadership, then you're great. But if you're not, it's an uphill battle. And so a lot of times I found I had to take my case to the people because I wasn't heard within the body otherwise. And so I'm just saying, like I said before, we've got different experiences. And so people are gonna, in other places, we're not a monolith. We're not all the same. And so, you know, we have to take different roads, different paths, and I've had to use different tools probably than either of the two of my colleagues that are here.
Okay. I guess from my perspective, coming in as a delegate back in the 90s and unexpected and into where I am now, I've seen a lot. I deal with a lot of people. You know, where I've been in, and in my role now, because of that, because I firmly believe everyone has something that they're gifted in. And a lot of times they're not placed in that position where they can do the most good. Could be a committee assignment, could be a special group, etc. And it may sound weird, but I look at, from my perspective, when I'm up at the rostrum, I look at people's faces and I can, you know, I can read people. And there are people who are more gifted in certain things, and there are others that if you put them in that certain way, they would fail. And you got to look at it both ways, because I don't want anyone to deliberately fail. So I guess from my perspective, maybe because my degree is in psychology, I I tend to look at things a little differently. And when I speak to young people, like in their classes and, you know, the elementary school, I tell them, each one of them, that has something that they're gifted in. And I said, you know, just hone in and you can, you know, you can be anything you want to be. You know, and so because oftentimes they have not heard that from someone, you know, so, you know, in this position, you deal with a lot of people. There's a lot of people who may not be on the same ways that you are, but sometimes that, you know, just because of that person, I don't let anyone, you know, steal my thunder, because, you know, that person, unless they're going to listen and saying, okay, this is what the real deal is, they're going to continue to think that way because they don't want to find that sometimes. But as we are in an elective office, it's our job to try to make sure that we're addressing the issues concerned for both our constituencies who put us in office, and also listening to our members who, whether you're a chair of the committee and some committee members may need a little more attention than others, or someone is very, very quiet, never says anything. But you have to be aware of what you're dealing with, and a lot of times just don't make assumptions. You got to make sure that perhaps there's something that's going on in that person, and I, like I said, I try to do that. So, and it's not when someone goes in the speaker's office like you're going into the principal's office. So, but I just want everyone, you know, no matter what their party, to be successful and not do anything that goes against what someone else's belief may be. They're entitled to that belief. So, and I just want to thank you, Tamelyn, for inviting us, because I know it's been about an hour now. So, for having us on this discussion, and we have, you know, two great colleagues here, and you know, and so I just wanted to thank you for having us.
Okay, I want
one
to
quick thing. For Speaker Jones, with the prior speaker, when I was in the House, going to the Speaker's office was definitely like going to the principal's office. I just want, but that's the difference in her leadership versus the predecessor.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank you all three for participating in this. I think we have a lot. I think this was a good discussion. We could go on and on, but Speaker Jones, in her way, has reminded us that we can't go on and on, at least in this forum. But I would love to continue this discussion. I think it's so important to think about. I'm just thinking about the couple of, the several kind of things that stood out to me that are right now that I'm on my mind, about your leadership style, about your connection and with your constituents, and your style of your various styles, because as Senator Carter has reminded, that you have had different paths, even though you are all you're all Black women in the state legislature. You've had different paths and different styles of leadership, and connecting to your constituents and styles of representation. And so I think this is all important for our discussion of Black futures, in a place where political work is done, important political work is done in the state legislature. And so I appreciate your frankness and your willingness to discuss these issues today, and hope that we can continue this conversation. And so just thank you so much, Senator Carter. Thank you, Speaker Jones. Thank you, Chair Atterbeary, for this important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.